Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So we're back to something that I've said before several times now, and that is that textbooks, there are two reasons to find textbooks interesting. One, the textbook is so supremely well written that it would be interesting no matter what, in which case we're talking about a fundamental basis of books. That is, if a book is well written enough, it can be enjoyable whether or not the book is on a topic that you are interested in. The other is, of course, if you're reading a textbook about a topic that you are personally interested in, then you will most likely find it interesting because you're fundamentally interested in the topic. The Gothic Cathedral by Christopher Wilson was one of the books that I was assigned during my second year of undergrad, and it was a course on medieval architecture, and, well, Gothic architecture is kind of the second half of big building medieval architecture, because there was Romanesque architecture, which I talked about the other book, which had a bunch of stuff about medieval architecture in it, earlier at some point. This one is an excellently informative read, but the one difficulty in this is that it is not a book with color pictures. The publication date on this is 1990, so this isn't like it's a book that historically was from so far back that you just couldn't afford to have color plates. This is just a book where color pictures have always been more expensive than black and white ones. I mean, we've gotten to the point now where I suspect the difference is negligible and most people aren't going to bother with setting a camera to black and white, but, you know, this was starting to come up on 30 years ago when this got published, so, you know, you're talking about a time when black and white reproductions were still probably significantly cheaper than the color ones. So the only color image in this is, well, this cover image. Now, the thing about this cover image, this is, if I am reading it correctly, Florence Cathedral, but I could be wrong. Oh no, this is Siena Cathedral. Anyways, the point is that one of the reasons why it's less necessary in the case of Gothic works to have them being colors, because unlike many of the earlier Romanesque and previous medieval works, Gothic tends to be, by this stage in the game, by this point in history, tends to be a lot of blank stone. And so it's all just gray, white, and black anyways, and the only color pop in it is going to be the stained glass. But as you look at this, you can see that the stained glass isn't adding significant amounts of color to this photograph. Now, I'm not going to talk about the book over much because this is a very, very technical book. In a lot of ways, this is the most useful thing in the book. And that is, at the very end of the book, right before you start into the bibliographic material, there is a breakdown here, an illustration of a church, where he gives you a little diagram here that says, here's what all of these things are. This is what a finial is: crocket, pinnacle, flying buttress, buttress pier, buttress overall, so that you can flip back to this whenever you need to and check against it, so that when he starts talking about an abacus or a capital or the clear story or Mullion's lights springing all of that, you can go back here and look at the picture and say, okay, that's what he meant when he was talking about that thing. This is a very, very technical book. It's a lot of technical breakdown of how, of what these churches looked like, why they looked the way they did. He starts off the book, and they're called chapters, but I'm not entirely certain you'd want to consider them really, really chapters. But he said he has effectively 3 chapters: Early Gothic, 13th century Gothic, and Late Gothic, each of which is broken down into subsets. The Romanesque antecedents, the beginnings of Gothic, Sujets Saint-Denis. The thing about Saint-Denis is that it's known as one of the very first fundamentally Gothic churches. This image here is of a Romanesque precedent, and you can see how stolid and rhythmically moving forward Romanesque churches are. That they were very, very long and repeating, and it's not about upward movement, it's about horizontal movement. Whereas as you look at then you see this is Saint-Denis, a couple of shots of Saint-Denis. I'm not going to show you every single picture in this book because we'd be here all day. But you look at Saint-Denis and you see here these lines, these pilasters, these lines that run up from the ground all the way up. That's because in the Gothic church, in the Gothic cathedral, the shift moved from a very forceful horizontal movement that dragged you forward sort of in an inevitable pull to the front of the church, and instead pulled you upward to the windows. And windows are a very, very big thing in Gothic cathedrals because, and I don't remember what all of these churches are. I believe this is Notre Dame. The thing is, you look at these cathedrals and these windows, these are very, very big windows, and the big windows, which were created by all of these new flying buttress techniques, by the creation of the pointed arches, all of these things, they allowed for bigger windows to get popped into walls that stopped being quite as forbiddingly thick. Oh, the walls continued to be thick. You wound up with these upper arcade areas that people could walk in because the walls were just so thick, and you'd sort of punch a hole in it in order to try and somehow let some extra light in. But the big thing with these cathedrals was these new techniques allowing for big windows. Here we have the front facade of a cathedral, which, again, I should have marked pages and I didn't. A few of these I left the side identification bubbles. This one I didn't, but you look at this and you can see this entrance here, these 3 sets of portal doors. The reason why you have the portal like that is because the walls are so thick to hold up all the weight of stone and the weight of the vaulting overhead. Walls in these churches were incredibly thick, and when you put in a rose window like this, you had to you were effectively punching a hole through like a several meters, several yard thick wall. Okay, and here's Chartres, which is where we see these external flying buttresses, which are such a key to the Gothic cathedral aesthetic. They're necessary. They're what holds the walls together. These things where you have just like this massive lump of masonry with bits sticking off of it that are there to take all of the weight of this vault, because you have these massive roofs which are made out of stone, and the stone roof here at Reims Cathedral or Chartres, without the flying buttress, the roof would just push outward and the walls would buckle and the whole thing would fall over. In fact, that's why so many churches fell down. And you can see here, you look at this vaulting, And he comments on it on this particular church. It might be Reims, I don't remember. Again, I never take notes properly. You can see how these vaults are sort of almost covering up the windows here in a way around the apse. And that's because they needed all of that there just to hold the ceiling up, because it's all stone. It's all really, really heavy stone. They don't have steel girders under there to take the weight. They don't have quite the same engineering that we do today, because today we have all of these various techniques to tell us about it. Instead, you just had people who had figured out what worked and stuck with it and knew some algebraic geometric math that would let them hold it up. We have here Troyes Saint-Urbain, we're moving here into some of the 13th century higher Gothic, flamboyant, rayonnant types of architecture, where you start seeing these traceries, where you start having, this is a bit of stone sculptured in here to add to the complexity of the window, because one of the things about Gothic architecture is, if you will pardon my turn of phrase, it is exceedingly Baroque as you move further along. There is also a bit of discussion about German and Spanish and Italian Gothic, because here's the thing is, and I apologize for the quality of these pictures. They look a lot better when they're a lot smaller and haven't been sort of stretched out the way they are here, but it's a bit of a comparison between the English and French, who were sort of the dominant developers and users of Gothic, and other countries that sort of eventually took it on because it was sort of the brand new fancy style. But at the same time, you can see a sort of a stolidity to, in this case, these two German cathedrals. And we have Lincoln Cathedral, where you start seeing this in the ceiling. Normally we think of Gothic architecture as not being sort of this off-kilter thing, but you can see it's been deliberately designed to not be regular, and even there's instead this, the word is not coming to me, but it's an interesting roof pattern. And he talks a little bit about this development as you start seeing liernes, that is, ribs that aren't actually connected to holding things up, but are instead there as decorative devices. And you can see that here in Westminster, and some really interesting stuff going on in the roof here in Wells. And he talks about how they developed, and this is an English thing in particular, also this, which is like just a beautiful, beautiful lattice work and just sitting there on the ceiling. And I'm going to talk a bit about Beauvais Cathedral, because this is just the apse. Here's the nave, that is the main body of the church where everybody sits. This is the apse. This is the front end of the church where, like, all of the, where the altar and everything else sits. And the reason that there's only an apse and the rest of the church is just this little thing down here is because they tried to build Beauvais, and the only part of it that stayed standing was this apse. The rest of it just fell over, and all that's left here is this lump of Carolingian stuff, because it just collapsed over and over again, and it's, between the tragedy of it, it's kind of funny. If you're interested, you should probably look up that story. And Siena Cathedral, you're looking now at a 14th century cathedral, but this is in Siena, and you can see this stripe, which is distinctively, like you see this sort of thing in Italian and Spanish churches and not in the other ones. And I'm almost out of time, and you should read the book if you're interested in, this being talked about in greater detail. And Yeah, that's everything. So I will see you all next week.